Historical, not biblical. I'll undoubtedly touch on the Gospels again as the discussion moves on, but in light of what's just been discussed, I need to stress what I found to be unsettling about a lot of mythicist conversation and writing. Mythicist arguments, to me, seem to too often conflate the historical Jesus with the biblical Jesus. There are many points mythicists make about how no contemporaries wrote about Jesus and his miracles, which is true. In an attempt at brevity, I'll explain why the miracle claims do not matter in relation to the historical Jesus. Mythicists will often state that no historians or writers at the time mention anything about, say, the walking on water, feeding the multitudes with fishes and loaves, healing the sick, or starting a riot in the temple during Passover, in addition to many other claims made in the Gospels. This is all true. We have no contemporary accounts of anything written in the Gospels as far as depicting Jesus and his movement in particular. This is a great argument against anyone claiming that the divine or miraculous stories in the New Testament are actually true. But then again, that isn't what this conversation is about. This conversation is about a historical figure who would have been the basis of these stories. We have many accounts of historical figures, some of which most likely existed, and others which definitely existed. Kim Il-sung, former dictator of North Korea, though deceased for many years, is still officially the head of the state, definitely existed. We have video footage, speeches, writings, you name it. Yet Kim Il-sung's birth story is very peculiar indeed. It is said that when he was born, it was under a double rainbow, and all the birds of North Korea gathered to sing a song. The mythical elements of these stories have no bearing on the fact that this man existed. In similar fashion, Siddhartha, also known as the Buddha, almost certainly existed. According, however, to the legends, his mother had a dream in which a white elephant crawled through a slit in her side. She later found herself pregnant, and upon giving birth to Siddhartha, the trees of the forest bent down to aid her in her birth pains. Also, according to these legends, Siddhartha was born able to walk, and lotus blossoms grew in his footsteps. Like I said, we have good reason to think that this man existed about 2,500 years ago, but that doesn't mean these legends are true. This is important to keep in mind when discussing the historicity of religious figures. Just because legend says that the Quran was given to the Prophet Muhammad in a cave by the angel Gabriel does not mean that Muhammad did not exist. Who else wrote about Jesus? I'll try to keep this section brief because, as I've already discussed, we have no contemporary writings about Jesus aside from the Gospels. David Fitzgerald, in his book Neld, makes a very effective timeline of when Jesus lived and when the earliest non-biblical writers wrote about him. Again, to make things brief, the Josephus writings about Christ are almost entirely unreliable for a few different reasons. One is that the supposed mentions of Jesus did not appear in his writings until the 4th century, after the early Christians searched through them thoroughly for any mentions of Jesus. And remember, Josephus was writing around the year 90. Another reason that Josephus' claims are very suspicious is that Josephus wrote that Jesus was the Christ and the Son of God, that Jesus was the Messiah who had come to redeem mankind and had been resurrected from death. These are writings one would expect from a Christian, but not from an adherent to Judaism, which Josephus was until the end of his life. Now, why would a non-Christian Jew write that Jesus was the Christ who was raised from the dead and ascended into heaven to go rule the universe? He most certainly would not. The Apostle Paul is often thought by mythicists to think that Jesus never actually existed in human form, I guess because Paul doesn't explicitly state so, but rather that Paul thought of Jesus as having lived in the divine realm and dying and rising there instead of on earth. To me, this is an extraordinarily hard claim to grasp. Apparently, this claim is hard for Professor Ehrman to grasp as well, as he points out in his book, Did Jesus Exist? That according to Galatians, Paul spent 2 weeks with Cephas, Simon Peter, and James, who it says is the brother of the Lord. Ehrman makes the case, which seems simple enough, that if Paul spent 2 weeks with Peter and Jesus' brother, would they not have mentioned that Jesus did exist physically? Peter and James certainly thought he existed, and it almost seems wacky to think that Paul wouldn't have felt the same way. This is, in my opinion, one of the biggest stretches mythicists have made in their arguments. There are some mythicist arguments which seem straightforward enough, but others, like this one, are on par with conspiracy theory thinking. To keep things as brief as possible, I won't have the time to address every point about the Paul debacle, or every point mythicists make in general. I can only say from reading the writings of Paul, though he does not explicitly state, "I think Jesus existed in the material world," he does seem to think that Jesus, in fact, existed in the material world. Reasons to think Jesus existed. Even though all of this is barely scratching the surface of this debate, I think the case so far should be enough to pique people's interest and at least keep people thinking on the subject of the historicity of Jesus. Again, I have no dog in this fight, as I think it doesn't affect my position that the Bible is unreliable and incorrect on many issues. The New Testament stories are untrue in my opinion, regardless of whether Jesus existed or not. So why think that a historical Jesus most likely existed? I think the best way to sum up the reason I think the historical Jesus most likely existed is because all of the stories seem to agree on that one thing. Even though these stories are shrouded in mysticism and magic, there is an underlying understanding that a man existed who went around teaching and preaching, who was later executed by the Roman government. We don't have historical records of Jesus and his works, but should we expect to? A peasant teacher in the first century desert whose following was most likely later exaggerated to make him seem as if he had more of an impact in his own lifetime. A man who was put to death by the Roman authority who was essentially a flea-like political dissident. I think Ehrman makes a very good case that the historical Jesus was a preacher who preached an apocalyptic message about the coming kingdom of heaven, which was going to end the world within his own lifetime. This explains why he is said to have told his followers that their generation wouldn't pass away until all of this happened. These teachings, once he had been put to death and several decades passed and no end of the world came, were later reorganized into something different. I don't think Jesus was born of a virgin. I don't think he and God are one because I don't think this God exists. I don't think he came to redeem humanity. I don't think he rose from the dead. I don't think he walked on water, made the blind to see, the deaf to hear, and I don't think he raised anyone else from the dead either. I think these are all stories that came out of decades of oral tradition in an illiterate part of the world that are based on the life and teachings of a man. Just a man. Nothing more, nothing less. One point I think is very interesting and that has seemingly gone unmentioned in this debate is this. Does it matter if Jesus existed? What I mean to say is that when someone asks me if I think Jesus existed, I can't just say yes without giving a book's length explanation for what I mean when I say that. I do think Jesus most likely did exist, but the Jesus that I think existed is totally incomparable to the Jesus a Christian thinks existed. If Jesus did exist, he was absolutely nothing like the Jesus presented in the Gospels or in modern Christianity. So does it really matter? In that sense, I don't think so. But in the quest for knowledge about someone who would have been the basis for the world's most popular religion, I think it does matter. But the historical Jesus, if in fact he did exist, would have been a cult leader teaching that the end of the world was soon to come, and good would be rewarded while evil was punished. Given more time, I think I'll make additional parts to this to help fill in the gaps in my explanations and reasoning because there's so much to cover on this topic. For now, I'll just recommend some reading on the subject by the previously mentioned authors.